Pain is a signal. It doesn't show up without reason. It brings to the surface everything you've spent a lifetime trying to bury, but contrary to what you might have been taught, when pain arrives, it's not here to destroy you. It's here to bring you back to yourself. Everything that stays hidden inside us eventually finds a way to scream. That scream might take the shape of a breakdown, a loss, a collapse, anxiety, or even silence. But beneath it all, there's an invitation to become who you truly are, not in spite of the pain, but through it. The world doesn't really know what to do with this. It demands quick fixes, forced smiles, scars that stay out of sight. Carl Jung didn't glamorize suffering, but he did say it becomes necessary when the ego resists the soul. And that's where pain can become the very point where awareness begins to bloom. There's an ancient figure that shows up in myths, dreams, and stories, one that speaks directly to this: the wounded healer. Someone who doesn't heal because they defeated pain, but because they walked through it and somehow stayed standing. Someone who learned how to breathe even when it felt like everything inside was caving in. And that's what we're diving into today: the psychology of the wounded healer. What happens when you stop running from your pain and start walking with it? Not as a burden, but as a companion, not as an enemy, but as a doorway. Maybe this feels familiar. Maybe there's a part of you that's been trying to heal for a long time. So take a deep breath and come with me, because sometimes healing doesn't come from the outside. It rises from the very place you bled the most. So tell me, have you ever heard of the wounded healer? A shaman once said that the soul only truly listens to someone who has screamed in silence, that there's a kind of knowing that isn't born of study or technique, but from the crossing. And the wisest people he'd ever met weren't the ones with all the answers, but the ones who stayed, even when everything inside them was begging to run. That's what this is about. The wounded healer is an archetype, a deep psychic image living in the collective unconscious. But it can also awaken within you. It doesn't symbolize someone who has completely overcome pain. It's someone who's been broken by it and, instead of hardening, chose to listen, to feel, to stay. This figure isn't on some pedestal, and they don't wear white. They're found in people life has scraped raw, who, instead of repeating the harm or numbing out, chose to hold their pain, not to appear strong, but because there was no other way. And in that quiet holding, they started to see the world with different eyes. In Jungian psychology, this archetype speaks of the wound as a turning point, a place where the ego loses its grip and the soul finally finds room to rise. The psychic wound, when faced with presence, becomes a portal, not to a better place, but to a deeper level of consciousness. And that changes everything. Because when you stop running from your pain, it transforms. It stops being punishment and becomes presence. You slowly start to become what you needed all along: a safe space within yourself. And it's often this closeness with your own wound that turns your very presence into healing for someone else. This is the wounded healer, not someone who rises above, but someone who meets pain without flinching. And from that radical honesty with their own story, a wisdom emerges that isn't taught, it's lived. But before this archetype can fully awaken in you, you have to return to the place where the wound began. That's where everything reveals itself. Every wound has an origin. Sometimes it's a sharp cut, a loss, a trauma, a violence that left visible scars. Other times it's more subtle, a silence that echoed too long, a love that never quite landed the right way. But in either case, something inside breaks. A psychic wound doesn't always come from a major trauma. Sometimes it's born from the quiet, constant absences, the daily invalidations, the sense that you're not allowed to be who you really are. It appears when a part of you tries to express itself and gets rejected, ignored, corrected. Slowly, it learns to hide. Jung said the ego, when it's born, needs to differentiate itself. It builds an identity to function in the world. But in doing so, everything that doesn't align with that identity gets pushed into the shadow. Emotions, impulses, memories, desires, anything deemed too much to show. And that's where the wound begins, in inner exile. The pain of carrying entire pieces of your soul that were never allowed to exist. The child who wanted comfort but was told they were weak. The teen who felt too deeply but got labeled dramatic. The adult still trying to fit in, not realizing they're always performing. This split creates a void, and if that void goes unacknowledged, it shows up. It seeps into relationships, decisions, symptoms. It becomes patterns. It becomes self-sabotage. It becomes the weight of trying to feel whole while missing a vital part of yourself. Many of these wounds began when you didn't yet have the words to name what you were feeling, when you only knew something was off but couldn't explain why. Maybe you felt like you had to earn love, that making mistakes was dangerous, that your existence was too much for others to handle. And your body remembered it all, because the body doesn't lie. It holds the memories the mind has tried to erase. And the psychic wound, when denied, doesn't vanish. It just changes form. It becomes tension, anxiety, chronic fatigue, loneliness in a crowded room. But this pain has roots. And when you face it without turning away, without trying to fix it, something begins to return to center. It's like forgotten parts of you, frozen in time, start to move again, to breathe. That's why Jung said, the path to individuation begins with the wound. Because the wound marks the exact place where you lost yourself, and only by walking through it, fully present, can you truly come home. Among the many myths that have survived the centuries, one carries a truth so heavy it's almost unbearable and yet deeply liberating: the myth of Chiron. Chiron was a centaur, but unlike the others, he was wise, gentle, a master of healing, astrology, art, and philosophy. He mentored heroes like Achilles, Asclepius, and Jason, but he was also wounded, accidentally struck by a poisoned arrow from Hercules. And because he was immortal, the wound never healed. He lived with constant, unending pain, and he held it. And in that holding, empathy was born, presence, true listening. He began to teach healing, not from a textbook, but from the depth of his own experience. He offered what he himself most needed. He turned his pain into shared wisdom. And when he eventually gave up his immortality to end Prometheus's suffering, he left us more than a myth. He left an image of what it means to transcend trauma, not by escaping pain, but by staying connected to it. That's what made him a master, not in spite of the pain, but because of it. Chiron is a symbol, a mirror. He represents what it means to live with an open wound and still find within yourself a space of clarity, compassion, and truth. The pain didn't disappear, but it became a doorway to something greater. In Jung's view, myths aren't just old stories. They're living expressions of the collective unconscious, and Chiron is one of those universal archetypes. He stands for all those who were hurt by forces beyond their control, who felt the sting of rejection, injustice, exclusion, and still chose not to become what hurt them. Chiron's wound isn't just physical. It's the ache of separation from wholeness, the loss of meaning, the world's failure to protect. But instead of being swallowed by it, he walks through it and transforms suffering into a path of healing, first for himself, then for others. This doesn't happen by magic. It happens because those who walk through their own darkness with awareness begin to see the unseen in others. They recognize unspoken pain, unnamed fears, unattended wounds. And in that recognition, something shifts for both. Your story might not have arrows or gods, but you know what it's like to carry a pain that doesn't seem to go away. And if you've made it this far, maybe some part of you is starting to understand. This pain you carry, it can teach you too. There's a part of you that learned to hide, that was silenced, corrected, punished, shamed, and because of that had to go undercover. That part didn't disappear. It just got pushed to the back of your soul, into the shadow. Jung called the shadow everything the ego couldn't or wouldn't accept as part of the self. And what goes into the shadow isn't just the bad. It's also the anger you weren't allowed to feel, the desire that got censored, the scream that didn't fit in childhood, the power that made others uncomfortable. It's your light along with your pain, your fire along with your fear. The wound we carry, often the one we can't quite name, lives there because what isn't acknowledged repeats. What isn't welcomed turns against us. The shadow starts showing up as symptoms, as patterns, as self-sabotage. It begins to ruin relationships, dreams, decisions, and the hardest part, you don't even realize it's you creating the storm that's pulling you under. Jung once said, "The shadow contains 90% pure gold." That doesn't mean pain is pretty. It means what's been rejected inside you has value, has life, has power. And that's why it hurts, because deep down, that part just wants to be heard, seen, integrated. The shadow is poison when it's denied, when it's projected onto others, when it's fought, when it's labeled the enemy. But it becomes medicine the moment you stop running and start listening to what it holds. Maybe the pain that cuts the deepest now is the very one you once had to bury just to stay accepted. Maybe your anger is really a twisted way of saying, "I exist, I matter, I have boundaries." Maybe your fear isn't weakness, it's memory. Maybe your silence once protected you, but now it's choking you. Looking at your shadow is an act of courage, but also of liberation. Because as long as it stays buried, isolated, it will keep screaming in the worst ways, sabotaging your life. But when you meet it with presence, without rushing to fix it, something begins to realign. The pain doesn't turn to magic, but it stops being your enemy. This integration doesn't happen through pretty words. It happens in the body, on the day you let yourself feel what you've been avoiding, in the moment you stop asking for permission to be whole. When you look in the mirror and for the first time don't try to erase what you see, but hold it, even if your hands are shaking, even if you're crying, even if you're scared. Because the part you rejected is the very one holding the key to your return to yourself. And only those who visit their own darkness can come back with the gold the world keeps searching for outside. This journey through darkness has been called, since ancient times, the wounded hero's journey, not an outward adventure but a deep movement toward the center of being. Crossing the shadow isn't the end, it's the invitation. It's where true transformation begins. The wounded hero's journey, not the hero of epic tales, slaying dragons and collecting trophies. This is the hero who agrees to descend, who walks through the labyrinth of their own soul without guarantees, without a map, with only pain as a companion. This is the Jungian hero, not the one who conquers, but the one who becomes aware. The structure of this journey is ancient. It begins with a wound, something that breaks the flow of ordinary life. Then comes separation, the unraveling of everything familiar. Relationships shift, certainties dissolve, your constructed identity starts to crack. And then begins the search, the attempt to understand, to fix, to go back. But nothing goes back because what's being asked isn't a return, it's a rebirth. The journey crosses a symbolic death. The death of who you thought you were, the death of the masks, of the roles that protected you, of the personas you wore to survive. Only after that death comes the return, but not a return to the old life, a return to the world with a new consciousness, a different vision, quieter, stronger, more whole. That's why pain marks the beginning of individuation, because it breaks, it disrupts, but it also calls. It creates space where the ego no longer runs the show, where the soul finally starts to speak. And when you enter this process with presence, you realize that being wounded isn't a weakness, it's a condition for awakening. Because only those who have touched their own edge with clarity can live with more truth. But not everyone completes the journey. Many get stuck in the same spot, replaying the wound as if trapped in an invisible cycle. It's not that the pain refuses to leave, it's that it hasn't been understood. There's a name for this in psychology: repetition compulsion. It's when what hurt you comes back in disguise, new faces, new stories, new chances, same pain at the core. Relationships that feel familiar. Self-sabotage with a new twist. Different scenes, same emptiness. Jung said, "What is not made conscious returns as fate." That's not a metaphor, it's a mechanism. The psyche tirelessly tries to surface what's been repressed. If you won't listen willingly, it starts to scream through painful choices, draining patterns, stories that feel like reruns, just with different backdrops. A wound left unacknowledged pulls you toward anything that reactivates it. It's as if part of your unconscious is constantly trying to recreate the original scene of the pain, hoping that this time it'll end differently. But it never does, because the healing isn't out there, it's in becoming conscious of the cycle you're in. This repetition isn't a sign of failure, it's a misdirected attempt to resolve something, a psychic effort to bring wholeness where fragmentation remains. And it only begins to fade when you reverse the motion. Instead of seeking outward, you look inward and realize that old pain is still alive, still waiting to be heard. The wound wants release, but first it wants recognition, not to become an excuse or your whole identity, but to stop being a buried secret. Because as long as it stays hidden, it will keep steering your life from behind the scenes. And maybe you're already feeling it. An old discomfort wearing a new face, a pattern you thought was gone suddenly resurfacing. It's not regression, it's memory. It's your psyche saying you still need to face this honestly. There's something even more subtle, maybe more dangerous than repeating the pain, trying to skip the process of healing, pretending it's already done, clinging to the idea that now, because you understand it, because you've read the books, helped others, it doesn't hurt anymore. That's the trap of inflated healing, when the ego hijacks the wound and turns the process into a persona. When someone touches the archetype of the wounded healer, but instead of integrating it with humility, starts to identify with it. As if saving others is their mission, as if their own pain is fully resolved, as if there's no more shadow left. In psychology, this is known as the Asclepius complex, named after the god of medicine, Chiron's student, who eventually believed he could cheat death and heal everything. Jung saw it as a state of psychic inflation, when the ego claims an archetypal energy bigger than itself and starts to act divine, as if it has a special calling, as if other people's pain is just a mirror for their own significance. And this becomes toxic because no one can hold that pedestal for long. The soul knows when it's being used as a stage, so does the wound. The person starts to distance themselves from their own vulnerability, hiding behind the mask of strong, wise healer. They offer listening but stop listening to themselves. They speak of love but avoid intimacy. They guide others to embrace their shadows while denying their own. And without realizing it, they slip into a kind of spiritual character where everything must make sense, everything must be healed, everything must look resolved. Real pain doesn't put on a show. And the archetype of the wounded healer doesn't demand perfection, it demands truth. It doesn't ask you to save anyone, it asks you not to abandon yourself in the process. Because when healing becomes performance, the soul gets sick again, this time disguised as light. That's why every deep journey demands humility, not to make yourself small, but to stay whole, to remember that behind every listening ear you offer, there's still your own pain that needs holding. That the most valuable knowledge isn't what you teach, it's what admits it's still learning. And when that listening doesn't happen, when your inner truth is silenced for too long, the body begins to speak, quietly at first in ways that seem disconnected. Persistent tension, exhaustion that won't lift, pain without a clear cause, unexplainable sensations, until one day you can't ignore it anymore. Because the body holds everything, it remembers what the mind was trained to forget. Every time you said, "I'm fine," When you weren't, every time you swallowed tears, silenced a scream, pretended it didn't hurt, the body heard and recorded it in skin, in muscles, in organs, as if to say, if you won't hold this with words, I'll hold it for you with symptoms. In depth psychology, somatization isn't just a side effect, it's the symbolic language of the unconscious. When the soul is overloaded with unacknowledged pain, the body becomes its voice. And this body, which has always tried to protect you, starts showing the signs of what needs to be seen. Many psychosomatic illnesses, chronic pains, anxiety attacks, extreme fatigue, they're not just physical. They're calls for presence, signs that part of your story froze in time, that was never told, never felt, never honored, so it still pulses like it's happening now. Maybe you learn to intellectualize everything, to power through, to cope. But your body doesn't want you to cope. It wants you to listen, to slow down, to approach this pain with less judgment and more tenderness. Because even in its most uncomfortable forms, what it's saying is simple. There's something inside that still needs care. And caring for it doesn't mean getting rid of the symptom. It means translating the message, asking, what is this pain trying to tell me? What got trapped? What needs to finally be cried out, screamed out, released? What did I ignore for so long that it became part of my flesh? When the body starts talking, it doesn't want punishment, it wants reconnection. And that reconnection isn't medical or magical, it's symbolic. It's the moment you stop seeing your body as the problem and start treating it as an ally, because it is. It always has been. When that listening begins, first in the body, then in the emotions, the memories, the inner images, something opens. But we can't always walk that road alone. Sometimes it's in the presence of another that the wound finally finds a mirror. That's where psychotherapy reveals itself as something deeper than technique, a symbolic ritual, a sacred meeting between wounded souls. It's not the therapist who heals, it's not the method or the diagnosis. It's the space formed between two truths that aren't hiding anymore. It's the courage of someone who's been through their own fire, now offering real presence, not quick fixes, because healing doesn't rush. Healing is held. Jung spoke of transference as this sacred phenomenon where the patient projects onto the therapist deep parts of themselves, pain, desire, past figures, and when guided with awareness, it becomes a mirror that transforms. The once silent pain finally has a space to be seen, named, felt without being denied. And it's not just the patient who's moved, the therapist is called too, because the wound of one finds the wound of the other. And if both stay present, no running, no controlling, no hiding, that meeting becomes a portal, a place where suffering is held with dignity, where silence becomes a womb, where time slows down, where what was buried starts to breathe. That's the heart of the wounded healer, not to heal others as a mission, but to create a space where others can finally meet themselves. And that takes more than listening, it takes humanity. It takes being fully there, even in silence. It takes bearing the weight of what is said and what cannot be said. At its core, deep psychotherapy is this: a conversation between wounds that recognize each other without invasion, a dance between presences that aren't trying to fix everything, just accompany what needs to emerge. And in that honest companionship, healing often begins, quiet, symbolic, real. And as that listening deepens, in the soul, in the body, in reflection with another, pain begins to shift. It doesn't vanish, but it stops being the enemy, stops being a sentence, begins to become a guide. And that's where the real individuation begins. Jung said, individuation is becoming who you truly are, not who the world expected you to be. It's a return to the center of your own soul, to what was forgotten, exiled, rejected, and is now asking to come back.